Hello and welcome to the IA channel. My name is Alexander Hammond. I am a policy advisor to the Director General here at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and thank you for joining us in the latest webinar in a series of videos conceived and hosted by the IAA. Following the death of George Floyd, we have seen protests all around the world. These protests initially started in Minneapolis, where George was killed, but they've soon spread across the globe to places as far afield as New Zealand or where I am here in the United Kingdom. Many people are rightfully outraged about George's murder, but the event raises broader questions about the America's criminal justice system. What policies have led to this situation? What changes need to happen for tensions to be eased? What actually is qualified immunity that we're hearing so much about? And is the US really a police state as claimed by The Guardian? To tackle this huge problem, I'm thankful to be joined by two superb guests who I hope will be able to give us the answers. First up, I'm joined by Clark Neily. Clark is a lawyer, legal scholar, and vice president of the Cato Institute, my old workplace. He is the author of the book, Terms of Engagement, How Our Court Should Enforce the Constitution's Promise of Limited Government, and his writings have appeared in all the big names and big outlets, including the Wall Street Journal and Forbes, just to name a couple. Clark is also the adjunct professor at George Mason University, where he teaches constitutional litigation and public interest law. Our second guest is Connor Boyak, the president of the Libertas Institute, which is a free market think tank in Utah. Connor is the author of over 20 books on politics, education, and culture. Connor has also written hundreds of columns and articles championing the ideas of individual liberty, and he is also president of the Association for Teaching Kids Economics. Connor has also written a series of children's books titled The Tuttle Twins that are designed to introduce kids to the ideas of liberty. And I know Clark and his children are big fans of those. And personally, I can't wait to read them to my goddaughter once she's old enough to. Gents, it's great to have you both.
Thank you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
So before we get started on the policy discussion of today, Clark, you're in Washington, D.C. at the moment, which seems to be one of the main epicenters of the protest. What's it been like on the ground? Is it as bad as we're seeing?
It is. The protesters are beginning to tail off, but certainly over the weekend, there were thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands of people in the streets protesting. They're very angry. Some of it spilled over, unfortunately, into violence and gratuitous destruction of property. Someone put a rock through the window, one of the main plate glass windows of the Cato Institute, where I work. But the anger and the frustration that we're seeing in these protests is, as we'll discuss, I'm sure today, in my judgment, entirely justified. And it would be a mistake for anybody, including the government, to simply dismiss these protests as, sort of just a lawless tantrum, because it's not. This is a political statement, and everybody needs to listen to it.
So, Connor, just to bring you in here, what do you actually think is the significance of these protests? Because I lived in Washington, D.C. for a few years, and there are infrequently protests like this. But are these protests slightly different? I know we've seen them across the world at the moment. So are these different, or is this just one of the ones we've seen plenty of times before?
Part of me, I can't help but be a little bit cynical that the reason that these protests have reached the apex that they have and around the world is that we've been sick of being quarantined for so long. There's a lot of pent-up energy to be released, and so people are excited to get out, and perhaps that at least contributes to why we've seen kind of this disproportionate spread of these protests so much, because people just want to get out and do something. But that cynicism aside, I do think, like Clark, that the quote is that protests are the language of the unheard, and there's people who are so tired of having these concerns dismissed, set aside, not listened to. And especially with social media assisting and kind of the infectious nature of these protests to really bring people out, I do think that you are seeing something significant right now, that people, they may not be able to articulate what they want to happen, but they can at least identify the problems. And I think it's up to folks like us to start to offer the solutions to say, we want to help, we do need systemic reform, let's talk about these ideas.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about these protests is how these ones have spread to the UK quite heavily too. In London, there's been thousands of protesters across the streets. There's been statues. There was a statue being torn down in Bristol of Edward Colston, who was a slave trader back in the 19th century, and it was chucked into the river. So it's interesting to see how this has spread, and I think that touches on the globalized nature of American politics, which I don't think we see is comparable from any other country besides the US. But Clark, how do you think Trump has been handling this situation? I saw a recent Gallup poll and actually showed Trump's approval ratings were the highest they've been. It was at 49%, and he's hit that a couple of times before, but he's never got above that, and actually higher than Obama's in May of his fourth year. So how do you think Trump's been handling it?
As usual, with his kind of signature blend of malice and fecklessness, he's very adept at exploiting disunity and anger. But on a policy level, he has been characteristically tone deaf and misguided. He's made clear that the White House, his administration, will be highly resistant to any form of meaningful change. And I think that he will look for opportunities to advance his agenda and to continue feeding off of this negative energy and division, which has really become, I think, kind of a trademark for him.
Yeah, so Connor, like I kind of see it as Trump's response was initially quite violent, and as maybe an act to try and subdue the protesters as quickly as possible. But do you think this will affect his chances in November, or do we feel that Middle America is kind of really on side with his approach?
That's the unfortunate nature of our two-party system, is even though there are many Republicans and independents, conservative-leaning independents, that are disgusted with his behavior quite often and really don't like his response to, the shutdowns or to the protests happening right now or whatever the issues of the day are. At the end of the day, people are going to feel like the lesser of two evils, triggers, and they want to avoid a President Biden, and so they're going to, plug their nose and vote for Trump. So I'm less certain that there's going to be any lasting damage from his, typical voting base in terms of how he's been behaving himself, because whether Trump, the candidate, 4 years ago, or Trump, the incumbent president right now, I do think there are people who are going to tolerate the things they don't like out of fear for having to swallow the things that they know that they hate.
Right, yeah. Worst of both worlds, really. So given the enormity of these protests, the situation we're seeing, it really does beg the question of how on earth did we end up here? And Clark, I know you recently penned a piece titled "America's Criminal Justice System is Rotten to the Core." So you don't think it's just a few bad apples that are causing the problems, but that the entire apple itself is rotten. What are the few main points that we should be considering about, especially us over here in the UK, a few key points that we should be championing and wanting to change in the United States politics?
Yeah, so I absolutely do mean it. I absolutely believe that America's criminal justice system is rotten to the core, and I identify three primary pathologies. And the first is what I call unconstitutional overcriminalization. And quite simply, what I mean by that is that the criminal law has only one legitimate function, which is to enable the state to discourage and punish conduct that threatens the very fabric of civil society. And if you allow the government to criminalize other kinds of conduct, then what you'll have is you'll have the state doing violence to peaceful people whose behavior does not really represent a serious threat to the rest of us. And that's an extraordinarily immoral and ultimately, as we're seeing played out in the streets of the United States, counterproductive approach. People will eventually begin to resent that, and they won't take it. They won't put up with it forever. The second major pathology in American criminal justice is that we've embraced what I describe as a point and convict approach to adjudication. We permit and indeed embrace coercive American-style plea bargaining, where we've essentially embraced the kinds of coercive tactics that other regimes have used throughout history. We just allow prosecutors to use other mechanisms besides physical torture, but they're basically allowed to use anything short of physical torture, and it's quite effective because more than 95% of all criminal convictions in America today are obtained through guilty pleas. And those guilty pleas are extracted under duress with the use of coercion, no doubt about it. And then finally, the last pathology that I identified in the piece that you mentioned is that all of this takes place in an atmosphere of near zero accountability for police and prosecutors. And so when you take all three of those pathologies and you add them together, what you get is a fundamentally rotten and morally indefensible criminal justice system.
Mm-hmm. So to touch on your first point about the over-criminalization aspect, and I think I definitely experienced that in my time in America. There's just a lot of very petty laws that don't really exist elsewhere. I know, for example, drinking outside, if I don't do it often, but that just isn't a problem. And I don't think anywhere in Europe, definitely not in the UK, jaywalking, things like that, crossing a road for our UK audience. So Connor, I know Libertas do a lot of work on this topic, and you did some work years ago regarding the death of a gentleman after the police raided his house because he had marijuana. Could you tell us about that and what are other petty laws that we really should be trying to get rid of?
So this is why I think Clark's first point about overcriminalization is so critical to understand. It's because so often these altercations that happen between law enforcement and a victim who they victimize stem from very petty issues. Look, what happened with George Floyd, the allegation of a $20 counterfeit bill, you can argue that he was, if that allegation is substantiated, victimizing someone else and trying to pass off a counterfeit dollar bill, and there was some potential harm being done. But it's, even so, that was very minor. And so many of the other cases that we're seeing where there's police excessive use of force stem from these incidents of, nonviolent conduct or over-criminalized things that lead SWAT teams to bang down people's doors. So such was the case with this gentleman, Matthew. Several years ago in Ogden, Utah, Matthew was a veteran. He was working night shifts, I believe at Walmart. He was sleeping in his bed naked one night when cops banged down his door. These cops were not dressed in uniform, SWAT gear. They were in t-shirts and jeans. They showed up into his house, banging the door, entering. Matthew thought that he was being invaded by a local gang that had threatened him in months past. As it turns out, the cops had been tipped off by his ex-girlfriend that he was growing a few marijuana plants in his basement, which, yes, was against the law. He had PTSD, and that's how he chose to self-medicate. And so a shootout ensued because Matthew thought that the guys screaming profanity from him coming down his hallway were hostile invaders. In the firefight that ensued, 6 officers were injured, one of whom died from their wounds. It's anticipated or believed that there was a lot of so-called friendly fire, officers accidentally shooting fellow officers in the melee of the confusion. It was a very small home. Matthew himself was injured. He was later detained, taken to jail, where he allegedly committed suicide. Some people believe that he was helped in that regard because he was branded in the media as a cop killer, even though these guys were literally wearing, nothing more than plain clothes, and he didn't know who they were. So that's what kind of brought us years ago as a newer organization at the time into this issue, where we began to realize that it's one thing to care about freedom. It's the other thing to try and really get your hands dirty in recognizing that the government, and specifically law enforcement, are often the perpetrators of some of the worst violations of our liberties that we can contemplate. And so that's why, as we're looking at the issues right now, especially with what Clark just articulated, those 3 points, so much of the reform that's needed. I believe we're going to talk about qualified immunity here, and there's some federal reform that absolutely is critical. But so much of this, these are local and state policies that are enabling law enforcement to go after and harass people for these very minor things, bring excessive force, no-knock warrants to enter their home in the dark of night, shooting dogs and children and adults. And this is really a high stakes issue. And so we believe it's critical for those who care about these ideas to be paying attention to the incentives that are in place for law enforcement to go about enforcing all these over-criminalized, these many laws in the ways that they are.
Yeah, and I think one of the suggestions feeding on from the story you just told us about that gentleman was in your article, Police Reform, Here are the Past and Future Ideas. You mentioned de-escalation training. And what sort of would that entail? Is that more learning self-defense, or is that just how to diffuse situations? Tell us about that.
So there's various modalities, I guess you can call them, of de-escalation, but they primarily center around trying to lead a certain altercation or an incident to have a more favorable and peaceful outcome than escalating the level of force that's being used. It's very natural for those in law enforcement, especially with past training, but also often their personalities and just the heat of the moment, to raise the level of force or introduce no force. De-escalation is specifically trying to counter those potentially natural tendencies to want to introduce sufficient additional force to deter a situation, to say, wait, let's have a conversation about this, and I don't want to draw my weapon, let's talk, or I'm going to take a step back, or let me come back tomorrow, and all these different things that you can do to try and peacefully resolve a situation that easily could go the other way. The problem that we see with de-escalation, it's kind of a buzzword right now. Everyone seems to want de-escalation training, and there's so many agencies that have implemented this without a ton of substantive reform. Because if you sit an officer down for a 4-hour class, check the box that he got his de-escalation training, that doesn't really have any lasting impact. And so what we think is really needed is a culture shift whereby the incentives for de-escalation permeate the law enforcement community. For example, having weekly meetings where examples of de-escalation are highlighted for all the peers to see and identify, oh, hey, that officer did it really well. That officer is being praised by his superiors. Perhaps there's some kind of financial incentive or award or other thing to create a culture shift where not only is this expected, but it's praised and it's incentivized and it's rewarded, because those are the type of human behaviors that we need to ingrain into the law enforcement community, not just sit them down and have them watch a de-escalation video for a few hours.
Yeah, I agree. I kind of think we need to change the culture behind it. And I personally think that all police should learn a self-defense art, something like Brazilian jiu-jitsu, because I think a lot of these situations happen when the police are overwhelmed by a subject, don't necessarily know how to control someone without resorting to the use of deadly force. Clark, you're shaking your head. What do you think on that?
I think that's a terrible idea. Police, almost without exception, police in America are highly trained in martial arts. A lot of them do it vocation as a sort of a supplement to their vocation. I myself am a martial artist. I have 3 black belts. When you look at the injuries that people sustain when they get into a physical altercation with the police, they are not what you see from a normal human fight. They look more like somebody who's been in a car accident or an industrial accident of some kind. I'm talking about crushed orbits, a nose that's been shoved over to one side of the face, broken jaws, things like that. I absolutely do not believe that it's the case that police generally find themselves at a disadvantage physically with people. On the contrary, police have an extraordinary array of force that they can and routinely do bring to bear on people. And it's not the case that if they would just use less lethal means like their own hands rather than a gun, that people would necessarily be a lot better off. And you really should look at some of the injury reports of people who've been in physical alterations with police. It's appalling the amount of trauma that people sustain. And so I would not be a big fan of encouraging police to increase their aptitude at basically stomping on somebody without weapons. They're dangerous enough as it is.
Oh no, that's an interesting perspective, and I appreciate that. My initial thinking was just kind of, if they feel overwhelmed in the situation, they're less likely to reach for their gun if they feel they can handle it. But point taken, and I'll look into that.
You'll almost never find yourself in a one-on-one encounter with a police officer. If they think something's going to go sideways, they bring friends.
No, that's true. You're fighting the biggest gang in the world. So, Clark, we hear, especially in the UK, that we don't really know what it means. Qualified immunity, end qualified immunity. I hear it. I see it on Twitter. I see it on my Facebook. I see it in the news. What does that actually mean? And why did Cato set up a website called unlawfulshield.com advocating for its abolishment?
Well, we did more than that. We held an event back in March, on March 1st, 2018, where we announced that Cato would be launching a campaign to eliminate the qualified immunity doctrine. And in just 2 short years, I think we're potentially on the verge of doing just that. Basically, what qualified immunity is, it's a legal rule that was invented out of whole cloth by the US Supreme Court to substantially narrow the scope of accountability and responsibility for government officials, including particularly police officers. We have a federal civil rights law that is generically referred to as Section 1983, because that's where it appears in the US Code. And 1983 provides the following. It provides that a state actor, meaning a government official employed by a state or local government, shall be liable to the person injured for the deprivation of any rights. And so there's no sort of qualifications. There's no defenses. It's just that a state actor shall be liable to the person injured for the deprivation of any rights. What the Supreme Court did was it took it upon itself to essentially judicially amend Section 1983, and specifically the part about any rights. So now, instead of being able to sue for the deprivation of any rights, which is the actual text of the law in question, you can only sue when it's a violation of what they call a clearly established right. And that's a term of art that means, in essence, that before you can sue a police officer or other government official for harming you in some way, you have to be able to show that there is a pre-existing case in the same jurisdiction where another police officer has done the exact same thing to somebody else, and the courts have already weighed in and said that is impermissible. And if that case with nearly identical facts is not already on the books, then your case will be thrown out of court on the grounds of qualified immunity. And so it really plays a tremendous role in ensuring and creating and fostering this environment of what I call near zero accountability for law enforcement. In fact, I call the qualified immunity doctrine the cornerstone of America's near zero accountability for police and other government officials.
So they can only be prosecuted if basically the same situation happened elsewhere, but the circumstances have to be virtually exactly the same.
Well, to be clear, it is a civil doctrine, so it only comes up in civil cases for damages. Mm-hmm. The reason why cops are hardly ever prosecuted, and they are hardly ever prosecuted, is not because of qualified immunity. That's because prosecutors have a massive conflict of interest that causes them to almost never charge police officers for their criminal conduct. And that's actually why it is so important to have a viable avenue of redress in the civil system, because there's absolutely no way you can depend on the criminal system to properly hold police accountable. And so if you can't do it yourself through the civil system, then it is not going to be done. And that's what qualified immunity ensures, that there's no really viable mechanism for holding police accountable through our civil law system.
Mm-hmm. So, Connor, I know your think tank does a lot of work on this. Are you optimistic this could be repealed one day, or how close are we to that in Utah or federally? Or
law enforcement community is very good at lobbying to maintain and increase their power. So historically, it's very difficult to get substantial reforms through. Look at something as odious as civil asset forfeiture, the ability of government to dispossess a person of property on a very low legal standard under this legal fiction that the property itself is guilty of a crime. Polling about this nationally here in America shows that like 80–90% of people hate the idea, and yet nationally it's difficult to achieve reform because the law enforcement community is very effective at what they do. This, however, this circumstance, all these protests, this upswell of anger has probably presented the best opportunity that we've seen in a very, very long time, and may yet see for a very long time, to try and counter that narrative, to try and push back against that organized lobbying effort. So I am actually, I would say, skeptically optimistic. I mean, Congress is not very well known for its substantial reforms and so forth. I do think that the states are a lot more of these reforms are going to be. Obviously, qualified immunity is a distinct federal issue, as a creation of the court. I've been and Clark would have insights on this than I, but we've been watching for the Supreme Court's announcement if they're going to take up these cases, and they've been expected for at least 2 to 3 weeks to announce if they're going to hear these cases. And I anticipate that the justices are sitting there watching the news, not wanting to drop this match into the tinder box of American society right now to say yes or no, because either way, there could be kind of a spillover effect of more animosity and more excitement on the streets. So I think it's very a good opportunity to see not only the courts take up the issue themselves. If they do, the justices are very reluctant to overturn past justices and reconsider past precedent. And so I'm a little more skeptical if the courts themselves will, create any substantial reform. But Congress is another question, and it, perhaps with a Democrat-controlled House like we do have right now, and all the virtue signaling that they like to do, perhaps something gets the House and we can apply the right pressure on the Senate and get something through. Whether Trump sends it, I don't know. But I think the best shot that we have had in a long time to try and at least further the conversation. Cato's doing really increased awareness about this problem, if not actually try and get through some solutions in place as well.
Right, yeah. So do we think it's more likely to happen in a Democratic-controlled Congress than a Republican?
I'll defer to Clark on that. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt that Democrats are much more sympathetic on this point, and but we're seeing some expressions of interest. I've been on the phone probably at least 2 or 3 times a day for the last 2 weeks with different members of Congress and their staffs, and I can say that Republicans are beginning to express some openness to qualified immunity reform. I will say this: I mean. I agree with everything Connor said about the challenges in the Supreme Court. One of the most difficult things to do in the Supreme Court is to get them to overturn old precedent. Another one of the most difficult things to do is to ever get them to rule in a way that disfavors government. And then when you add those two together, it's a heavy lift. So anytime, but I mean, look, anytime the question is, will Congress and the Supreme Court pass the buck back and forth and then ultimately do nothing to solve a problem? Yes, is always a safe bet. But this issue has really, I think, roiled the American public in a way that very few have before. And somewhat surprisingly, qualified immunity really has kind of become, I was going to say the scapegoat, but that's an inaccurate way to put it, because qualified immunity deserves every single ounce of resentment and opprobrium that's being directed towards it. Again, as the cornerstone of our near zero accountability policy for law enforcement. And I would say that if I had to bet, I would say that the odds of either being rid of qualified immunity or having it substantially restricted and limited a year from now are well above 50%.
Those are good odds. Those are good odds. So just before we wrap up for today, one more policy area I'm interested in is, Connor, I know you wrote in your piece recently about the militarization of police. So are you just referring to weapons when we're talking about militarization of police, or is it something else? And just tell me about that. What does that term mean, and what's been happening in recent years regarding it?
So police militarization is in large measure a byproduct of what's called the 1033 program. This is a federal program that allows for surplus military goods, weapons, armored personnel carriers, grenade launchers, helicopters, basically anything the military would be using to, once it's decommissioned, put into surplus property, to be given to local law enforcement agencies throughout America. Now, of course, obviously since 9/11 and all of the foreign military adventurism that the American government has been engaged in, there has been abundance of military items that are being then trickled down and given freely to local law enforcement. I haven't confirmed if this has been the case the past couple of years, but when we were last working on this issue 3 or 4 years ago, the policy at the time was that any local law enforcement agency receiving such goods was required to use them within 1 year or give them back, creating a tremendously perverse incentive for the local sheriff in Podunk, America, to find a way to use his tank, to find the situation where he can, bring the grenade launcher to bear or whatever, because he wanted to keep it. They got this new toy. There's an excellent book by Radley Balco called Rise of the Warrior Cop that documents much of this trend. And what you're seeing throughout America is these communities that are acquiring these tools of military force violence that's used overseas, that's used for combat against an enemy. And, look, if a law enforcement officer is receiving a bulletproof vest or a rifle or something like that through the program, no big deal. They have plenty of those on their own. When you get into the grenade launchers and the tanks and so forth, that's a little bit different. But one of the biggest problems that you have with this trend of the past couple of years, and especially a lot of veterans, right? Military officers who then become police officers, you start to have that mindset start to infect law enforcement. There used to be a very clear division between local law enforcement, peacekeeping in America versus, going and fighting a war against an enemy somewhere abroad. You see now, I feel like, and I think as Balco and others have documented, a blurring of those lines where watch the videos now, go on social media and see any of these protests and see the gear that law enforcement is using, see the tactics that they're using. It much more has a feeling of military in some battle zone in the Middle East than it does, the blue shirted, nice police officer just trying to keep the peace. So
Yeah.
it's really a mindset shift that has been facilitated by some of these policies in place that have enabled the militarization. As we've worked on this over the years, the police very much object to this term, at least the ones we've interacted with. They don't like to be accused of being militarized. They don't perceive it that way and believe that that is the case. But when you just do a simple compare and contrast from, a couple decades ago until now, you do see very clear behavioral differences, if not also logistical differences in the gear that they use. And it really opens up this question of, is this what we want patrolling our community? Is this what's effective to keep the peace? Or is this really this kind of battalion driven, law enforcement mindset where, hey, citizen, you will obey or we will crush you? And, for those of us who kind of pine for a America of yesteryear when things were a little bit different, it is a concerning trend. And so I think there's reform both on the federal side here, where there's talks right now among some members of Congress to shut down that program that provides those military goods. And then groups like ours in the states are having conversations about, even if that program continues, let's just get our legislature to say our law enforcement will not participate in that program. We're just going to walk away and stop.
Yeah, so again, comes down to unintended consequences of it all. So we're fast running out of time. Clark, I'll turn to you for some closing thoughts first. So do you think the protests we're seeing, bringing it back to current affairs, will lead to concrete change? Are there anything that libertarians interested in American criminal justice has to be optimistic about in the next few years? Give us some optimism, Clark.
So I will try. But the fact of the matter is, so yes, there will be change. But the thing that you really need to understand is that the law enforcement lobby is the second or third strongest in the country. It is extraordinarily powerful. The US Department of Justice actually has an in-house lobbying shop called the Office of Legislative Affairs, and very little happens on Capitol Hill without the approval, in essence, of the Department of Justice. And at the state and local level, it's very similar. So I think two things are true. I think that the protests will prompt some change, but I think that change will be relatively incremental and relatively ineffective. I think that the real question is whether this moment in time will inspire people to embrace the idea of imposing change on America's criminal justice system from outside, without the acquiescence of legislators, police officers, and prosecutors. That is a real question. It can be done. I have lots of thoughts along those lines. I think what's necessary is to summon both the will to do so and to just let go of the false hope that the system has any interest or willingness to reform itself. It doesn't. The system is recalcitrant, and change must be imposed from outside.
Great. And Connor, do you agree with Clark's diagnosis?
Yeah, I do. Again, the cynic in me feels like once the new media event happens, something catches everyone's attention, we start to turn away from the kind of the collective animosity and even support for reform right now. So I'm a little bit hesitant to think that this is going to be long lasting. We've seen protests before, we've seen outrage before, but then the media, points our attention elsewhere, and our daily hate, focuses our attention on something else to be upset about. But those of us working in the trenches, I do believe that right now presents an opportunity to capitalize on, and I don't know how far we can get the ball moving forward, but I am excited to try.
Right, that's a great point to end on. Thank you, Connor. Clark and Connor, thank you so much for joining us today. I know I won't be the only one to say I've learned a lot from today's discussion and your fascinating insight. And despite all the troubling things going on across the world, one positive development of recent months has been the brilliant content uploaded to the IA YouTube channel every single day. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the button below, and also the bell icon, so that you can get updated whenever we release a new video. Also, a big thank you to donors who make events like this possible. If you can help us in any way financially, no matter how modest, we'd appreciate it greatly. And you can find the details on how to do that at iea.org.uk. Thank you very much to all of those watching at home. Clark, Neily and Connor Boyak, it's been a pleasure to chat with you both. Keep safe, keep well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.